Hi, Gautam. Good morning.
Good morning, Indranil. Good morning, everyone. It's now 11 o'clock, and it's a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here today for the webinar. We have business storytelling, but didn't know whom to ask, by Indranil, who's an international author and speaker of the book Stories at Work. Last week, we hosted Indranil on this platform, and we had an overwhelming response with over 500 people participating, but 900 people had registered. So we said, great chance to continue the conversation from last week to questions that remain unanswered, and obviously welcome back to those who are here. So welcome to those who want to continue the conversation, and a warm welcome to all of you who have joined us for the first time. Thank you. Just to give you a brief introduction, our organization, Right Selection, our father and son family business, started over 25 years ago. And we're in the business of creating learning experiences. And obviously in the current climate that we're in, we said we want to continue providing high value content to people who appreciate learning. So we're going to be hosting these webinars twice a week for the coming 3 months, and look forward to your participation and sharing these. Thank you. So the first question that we have is from Nilesh. That's, how can I exercise storytelling when my organization is not pro to using it? Rather, they prefer going with traditional methods of presentation. I'm a mid-level professional, mostly presenting to VPs and directors.
So, Nilesh, I know you can't answer this question to me, but I was just wondering whether you tried doing storytelling and were you stopped saying, don't tell me a story, yeah? Or you just believe that storytelling will not be acceptable. So I'm going to take both these options. So let's start by saying that you believe that storytelling is not going to be acceptable because no one in your organization has done it before. Then I guess you have to go and be what Mahatma Gandhi had said to us, right? Be the change you want to see in everyone and start it out. Yeah. And you don't have to start it out in your first presentation to the CEO. Start it out in your team. And as people get to see that using stories, your messages and is far more easy to understand and easier to remember, you will get more and more people understanding the power of it. Now, that's if you assume that storytelling would not be important. Let's say you tried storytelling and you were stopped by a senior saying, ye kahani mat batao, yeah, which is what we've heard many times. Then perhaps what you need to learn is two things. One is, how do you tighten your story? Yeah? Because in business, you can't tell a story that is all over the place. And so you need to find a way to tighten the story. And I'm going to spend 2 minutes to tell you how you can do that. And the second thing is that do not use the word story when you're telling a story, which is, don't start by saying, let me tell you a story. You don't have to do that. If you just go on saying, this reminds me of, the brain knows that's a story, but you haven't triggered the labeling. Yeah. The problem is not with storytelling. The problem is the label in many corporates that we have put to stories. So, so the answer to if you've been asked not to tell a story, so A, don't use the story word. B, tighten your story. And yes, of course, C, do not use the storytelling voice. It was a dark day in December when the client walked in. We are not into performance storytelling. So if you leave those out and tighten your story, how do you tighten stories? One, tell the story to 3-4 people before your presentation and just see what feedback they give you. And with that, you will automatically tighten. The second is write down the story you just said, and then take a pen like a surgeon takes a knife and go through each word and each sentence in your story and see what can you get rid of and still pass the message in. And then you have a tight story. And I think if you do these two, then you should be good to go. Thanks.
The next question we have is from Joanne. How do you ease in the storytelling part without being too pitchy?
Okay, so I assume pitchy in the sense that to snake charming salesman. So first of all, let me go back to what is my definition of stories in business. My definition of stories in business is stories are facts. What I help people to do is wrap the fact in context and deliver it with emotion, right? So first of all, if you stick to facts, then you are not going to be pitchy. What is pitchy? Coming and saying, telling a story about how my product is the best or my service is the most excellent. That's pitchy. But if you tell a story of which allows me to come to the conclusion that your product is the best, or your product is most effective or efficient. Let me give you an example. You could go to a client and say, let's say you are in the IT services business. And one way to go and just to the client saying, we are extremely client centric. We always have a client best in mind. We bend backwards to, help. That's not storytelling. Or if you say we always do it, or we have done it with many clients in the past. Instead of that, what if you said something like this? And I'm making it up, but I'm sure if, incidences like this may be true. You say, I was just talking to Peter. Peter is the CEO of one of our client companies. And Peter was telling me why he continues to work for us. And he remembers the day, 3 years ago, it was a Friday evening in the US. And Peter just got a call from his finance team saying that there is a problem with the IT server, and the payroll won't get action this time. And Peter knew that his support team, which is my company, is in India. And Friday evening for Peter would mean almost late evening or midnight for us. But Peter made a call to Santosh. Santosh is the one who handles this account. Peter explained that the payroll was supposed to run on Monday, and they didn't know what to do. Over the next 2 hours, Santosh had his entire team move into the office. Their team worked through Saturday and through Sunday afternoon, and by Sunday evening, the payroll was good to run. And Peter believes that's why he continues to work with us. Now, you don't have to go and say that you're extremely customer-centric. That story would have told it for you. So that's how you ease into storytelling. I hope I answered that question.
The next question is from Siddhartha. What can we do to make internal audiences internalize business stories and want to be a part of the story going forward?
Good question. There are two ways. One is which a part of which I answered when Nilesh asked the question, is be the change you want to see, which means if you believe that stories is a great way to bring, to communicate, start using stories yourself. And as other people see that the way you communicate is more inspirational, your message is more sticky, people will start following. The other is to introduce storytelling into the organization in a non-threatening environment. Let me give you an example. So a lot of my clients, when they ask me, how do we do this? I say, okay, if you suddenly call your leadership and say, I see he's going to come and teach us storytelling, there may be heckles. Yeah, no. Why we are doing storytelling? We don't want storytelling. So what I tell them is, do you have an annual conference coming up, or some kind of a get together? And if yes, call me in as a keynote speaker. Now, it doesn't have to be me. You can call in any expert in storytelling. And, in a conference environment is just another person coming and giving a speech. I mean, you had Navjot Sidhu to Harsha Bogle to, Captain Raghuraman, someone coming and speaking. Yeah, I come and speak. It's non-threatening. And use that person, that expert, to show how storytelling can be very powerful. And then when that is over, ask people, do you think we should get this into our organization? How many of you would like to learn this? And take it then as something that people want to do rather than what you're thrusting them to do. Yeah, I think that would be my answer.
This is from Raja Manikam. How do you find the appropriate story when we do not have real life examples? I think this is something that you share again.
Yeah. So first of all, I think I'll question that you do not have a real life example, because if you really believe in something, and we talked about it in the last webinar, we all have opinions and advice to give. Where are those opinions from? None of us were born with the opinions and advice. So according to me, and I'm happy to get corrected if I'm wrong, but according to me, there are only two ways we can get an opinion. One, I went through an experience myself, and that experience gave me this opinion. Two, I heard about an experience of someone that I trust, either heard, read, or seen. Yeah, I can't think of a third place to get an opinion. Now, if I translate that into my language, opinions and advice are a result of stories that I've been part of and stories that I've heard, read, or seen. So I would urge you to first stop and ask yourself, why, if you really believe in something, then why do you believe it? Yeah. Now, let's assume that for whatever reason, you're not able to get it. Now, obviously, there is no one repository. Yeah. You need to build your story bank. Where do you get great stories? Actually, you get great stories in any business book. Go back and look for tiny anecdotes. They'll be filled with story. It doesn't have to be, a biography. Of course, I mean, let's say Satya's Refresh is full of stories in every chapter. But even if it's not that, pick up any book that you like and start reading that. You'll find it's full of stories. Yeah. Temporarily, just as a starting point, you could go to the Storyworks YouTube channel. I'm just going to put the bit.ly in the chat. And there is 41 stories that I have shared in that YouTube channel. And there are about 25 stories that leaders that I've worked with have shared with me. And so if there is a bit.ly, if you take that and click it, you'll go to the Storyworks YouTube channel. You'll find about 65 stories. But of course, the world of stories is much bigger than that.
The next question is from Sujit Kumar. How do you explain the financial performance with a story? Let's talk about monthly financial performance. If you can give one example, that would be great.
Okay. So how do you explain, how do you use storytelling in a financial performance? Now, if your financial performance is going on a steady upward or steady downward, there is nothing new to add. I'm starting with that premise, because then you don't need to do any storytelling. You can just go and say, we continue to grow like the way we're growing, or we continue to decline the way we've declined. Yeah. Now, I think storytelling comes up when there is an aberration in the data. Let's say you were growing and then suddenly you fell. So now your chart and your graph shows that. Your storytelling will be about what is that happened that made it fall. Now, a lot of time people in organizations just say, this fell because the customer satisfaction on the new, let's say new feature we launched in our product was not satisfactory. Now, that is what people don't. So what if you said, you see this dip here? You'd remember that 2 months ago, Ajit and the team from our R&D had introduced this feature. And we were talking to customers last month. And, I remember talking to Mrs. Sharma, and Mrs. Sharma was explaining how she switched from our product because this new feature, it's actually making it more difficult for her to use. She had loved the product for all these years, but now that she was struggling to use it because of this new feature, she's shifted to a competition. And Mrs. Sharma is not alone. There are multiple Mrs. Sharmas, which explains why the dip is happening. So what you do with storytelling in the financial performance thing is explain what the change is all about. The second thing you can do is walk people through the journey you had if you have made a sort of insight in the financial performance. So let's say you're doing some mathematical number and you have suddenly found an insight as to why this change happened. So you could say, can you see this graph that suddenly dipped? I started wondering why it was dipping. My first thought, like most of you would think, is maybe whatever the first thought. Let's say your first thought is the market is getting saturated, but I checked, that was not it. Then I checked this, and then I checked that, and then I came into the aha moment. So you walk through your journey of how you came to the insight. That could be another way of doing the storytelling in a financial performance.
The next question, is there an audiobook for Stories at Work, guys? This is from Tushar Kakkar.
Yes, there is an audiobook, and it is available on Audible or on Amazon.in. It is a book that I recorded myself, so it's my voice. And Piyush Pandey, who wrote the foreword, recorded his part of it as well. So yes, it is available on Audible and on Amazon.in.
From Deepak Barara, in India, people shy away from sharing failure stories. How do you see them in terms of learning and importance?
I think failure stories are perhaps the most powerful stories that have given us. So, but you're absolutely right. The corporate world is all about success stories, and it is not the most natural thing to do. But to me, if as a leader you're confident of who you are, yeah, then actually talking about the struggles that you had, or the things that went wrong, and how that what went wrong gave you the aha moment, is going to be extremely powerful. Not only did you learn from that failure, others learn from that failure. Yeah, that when you narrate it, and I'm sure it's true for everyone on this call. Some of our biggest learnings have come from what has not worked. So every time someone says, in my company or in corporate, that doesn't happen, I say, who's corporate? Who's my company? You are included in that. Start the journey yourself. Yeah. And so if you're confident about who you are and what the work you do, you can always share about how you didn't get it right the first time. And that would be very powerful.
This is an anonymous attendee, but interesting question. Since the title says stories at work, does that mean we can't use them in our personal lives?
Very good question. Okay, now you can. The principles that I've used in the book Stories at Work can get transferred. Just that the examples that I've used and the context I've used has been in business, because we are natural storytellers when it comes to all of you, the 193 participants, in basically the panelists and the attendees put together. Everyone is a storyteller. There isn't a human being born yet who is not a good storyteller. The challenge has been of taking that into the workplace. Now, some of you must be thinking, no, I'm not a good storyteller. Now, tell me, the last time you came back from a holiday and met someone in office, did you zip your lip and quietly keep working? Possibly not. You went and told what happened in the holiday, and I'm sure you didn't make a PowerPoint presentation. So you said something like, you know what? We had booked the trip on Make My Trip at 10 o'clock with the wife and the two kids. We reached the hotel, and the bugger says there's no reservation. And then this happened and that happened. What were you doing? Storytelling. Now, coming to exactly your question. So if you read the book, but take away the context that I've used of business and look at the principles that I've used, that is translatable.
The next question is from Ranganathan. You shared in your last webinar last week that the story has to be real and gain credibility. But many times speakers use imaginary stories to create interest. Is it not considered as storytelling?
It is considered as storytelling. I would never do it. Yeah. Why? Because you see, we talked about this earlier, that there is a sort of a mental block in business about stories. Yeah. So when the boss said, why did this happen? And you're trying to explain, and the boss said, Kahani mat batao. What does that mean? That story is made up, and people in business don't want to talk about made up things. They want to talk about real things. And my submission is, there is so much reality and so much experience that is real. Why would you want to get to something imaginary? Yeah. So yes, there are speakers who do that, but I think in business, if you use imaginary stories, you lose credibility. And that's why I stick to something that is proven, factual, double checkable.
Is business storytelling more useful while handling difficult or negative situations?
Yeah, I think that was a great question. So that's why I'm sorry I brought your attention to that. So I think it's not that it is more useful, and I don't want to start comparing usefulness in positive or way, but it is very useful even in negative situations. And this is especially true when you're giving feedback, right? You call someone in your room and said, I don't like the way you do this. You are extremely inefficient, or you're never getting things right. Now, those are assertions. If you could use examples. So what is stories in business? Stories in business is another way of, if you didn't want to use the stories, experiences. Can you tell me experiences that have led to that negative thing that you have are going to share with me? Similarly, let's say you're doing a retrenchment. Yeah, a lot of bosses will come and say, I'm sorry, I have to let 20 of you up to the 100 people go because that's what my boss has said. You lost your credibility. Can you tell the story of what has led the organization to come to that unfortunate decision that they have to let 30 people go? So if you walk them through what happened and to bring in as to why that negative thing has to be shared, I think that would help.
This is from Papa CJ. How powerful can humor be in business storytelling? How appropriate is it? How can you share examples of how best you have seen it used?
If this is the Papa CJ that I know,
Very
great
much
to
so.
have you on the show. So, how powerful can stories, humor be in storytelling? We were asked this question the last time as well, so I'm going to answer it almost similar. It can be brilliant, but I usually suggest people not to do it. Why? Because not everyone is a Papa CJ. What do I mean by that? Um, if your humor cannot be delivered well, then while humor can be extremely powerful in storytelling, you just got it all wrong. For I can't do it well. When I have a great joke to say, by the time I've come to the last line, I'm already laughing because I know the last line, right? And so that would be a disaster. Second, if I'm going to share something humorous that people have unfortunately already heard, it's no longer humor, right? So do you have a natural story that you can share? And B, do you have comic timing like you do? Then that'll be brilliant. And third does that humor is that humor central to the story that you're saying, right? So let me give you an example, and this is not mine, so and I'm sure you've heard of it. Let's say I was talking about public speaking. Yeah, and that was the speech I was going to give. And I start that speech because I know there's fear in public speaking, and I start that speech with what Seinfeld had said. And he started saying, every year in America they do a survey as to what do Americans fear most. And every year there is almost the same results come for the top three. And you know what is the number one fear of an American? Public speaking. And number two, death. Which means if you have been invited to a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. Now, that's a fantastic story and humorous story to use when I'm doing public speaking. Unfortunately, that's already taken. So just to summarize, if you have comic timing, if you have something that I haven't heard before, and three is if it fits in beautifully into storytelling, absolutely use it. But that's a rare combination to have. Thanks for asking.
This is from Sujit Kumar. How do you connect a story to a situation? How do we make that bank of stories? Is it something we need to make a note of? And any best practices to create a story bank?
Okay, so that's a pretty long question. So you're right. You have to make a story bank, and the reason you have to make a story bank is you possibly cannot remember all the stories that you know, right? So how you need to store it somewhere. The second is even the stories you know, it is very difficult to remember the story when you need it in business, right? So for example, let's say you wanted to make a point to someone that skill and competency is not something that will guarantee success. And you wanted to find a story that would be very appropriate for this point. Yeah. I'm pretty certain, stories don't come to you like this. But tell me now, if I tell you, do you know the story about Vinod Kamble and Sachin Tendulkar? Yeah. Do you know that when they started, they were not only equal, probably Vinod Kamble was a batsman with more flair, perhaps even more talent. But because he didn't put his practice in, did not have the right attitude, etc., he fell through, and Sachin went to where it is. And which is why I believe that skills and competencies are not the best of success. You would have never remembered why, because you remember, human beings remember stories with the character. So when I say, do you know the story of Vinod Kamble and Sachin, you'll say yes, but you don't know that story as a story about skills and competency. So in your story bank, you need to create it in a way that is searchable through the point. And again, it's going to take a long time to explain how. So we recommend the use of an app called Evernote. Yeah, I'm not going to take you through it. If you go to the Storyworks YouTube channel and look, there is a whole tutorial of how do you store stories in that note. And any of you who have the book Stories at Work, there is a chapter which says, which is chapter 3, which says how to build your story bank, and it has a very detailed answer to your question, Sujit.
This is from Yash Rawat. How to keep our stories crisp and short. Many times it happens with my clients. They say to cut short and convey the end message.
I think we answered part of the question earlier, which is that when I think Nilesh had asked that, and I said, you need to practice your way to shorten it. So I'll just repeat what I said. How do you make it short? One is you try and say it to 2-3 people, and you'll automatically realize, oh my God, why am I saying this? And you'll drop it. Once you've done those 2-3 times. Now write down that story that you are going to say, and then you go through word by word and line by line and say, what can you get rid of and still convey the message the story is trying to say. And when you do that, you will be able to get the story to be much shorter.
In data presentation, most storytelling is used to pull the attention by most presenters. They use it. Is that the?
Okay, so no, I'm not sure I'm with you, but let's say that there is a presenter who uses a story to get attention. Now there are two kinds there, right? If I'm using stories to get attention towards me, then that's a wrong thing to do, because what is the presentation about? About the data or the message that I'm sharing. So if it is about just getting my attention to me, doesn't work. If it is just about getting attention for the sake of attention, it doesn't work. I mean, I'm going to be facile here, but let's say I get up on stage before a presentation and take off my shirt. Oh boy, I'll get a lot of attention. But what has that got to do with the presentation I'm making? Similarly, if the story has nothing to do with the data I'm sharing, then it doesn't work. But we answered this question a little while earlier about how do you use data in financial performance. To me, our stories in financial performance, the answer to that is the same as the answer to how do you use stories in a data presentation.
The next question is from Priyanka Yadav. How can we use storytelling for engaging with employees and customers during the current COVID and post-COVID time? Can you guide some in this area?
So again, I think whether it is the COVID time, whether it is any time, I think what comes first is not the story. What comes first is what is the message you want to pass through that story, or even before that, what is the message you want to pass in the conversation you're having? What is it that you want that person to remember of what you're saying? And then can you find an example that shows that what you're saying is the right thing to do? For example, let's say the point you're making because of the COVID situation is that while people are doing distancing, and I like the term physical distancing more than social distancing, but because people are doing distancing, people are working from home, it is important to reach out and connect much more than we connect in office. Let's say that's the point you're making as a leader, that please connect, etc. Now that's going to go through this year and get out of this. Can you give an example of any situation where a team that was more connected, even though they were not physically close, was actually better off? Now you might say, oh, COVID has never happened. That doesn't matter. Yeah. Other situations might have happened where, let's say, the best team to put together was people from different countries. Yeah? Clearly, you couldn't fly them for every meeting, and so they're physically distant. So, and if you tell that story of that team, and because they did a check-in in the morning, they did a check-in in the evening, they kept in touch, they even celebrated, even in their own houses, maybe when something went right, everyone got a drink in front of their camera and said cheers to it, and that created the bonding. Then you'd have got a great example to share.
This is from Alok Purohit. How do you realize whether the situation, meeting, or discussion needs a storytelling or not? How do you know it's appropriate time?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that a little differently, which is, what are the only non-appropriate time to store story? Because my answer is every time is appropriate except two. Yeah. So one is when what I have been asked to share is a close-ended question or data. Yeah. So close-ended as I can answer yes and no, or data. So if boss says, oh, what was the sales deal last week? You can't say, 5 years ago, boss, and you start a story. It doesn't work, right? So close-ended questions, I wouldn't use a story. The only other time that I wouldn't use a story is when the person across the table or wherever I'm talking to is highly agitated, angry, distressed, etc. There, people are not even listening. So there, I don't want to even spend the 30 seconds, 90 seconds that tells a story, because that person is not listening. So what do we do there? I don't know what you do. Do whatever you currently do to first settle that person. For example, my favorite thing in office was I used to say, it's my fault, okay? Get down. And usually people love it. They get down. And then I can tell a story that proves it might be somewhere else. So only two conditions where I would not tell a story. One is if it's a close-ended question. Two is if someone is agitated.
One is from Kronal, I mean, more on the personal side, but how do we use storytelling within family, especially with our children? Anything you can share in that space would be welcome.
Okay. So again, in terms of like I answered the question I think Julianne had asked, which is, can this be used at home? So the principles of how you can be on point in the story, how can you tighten the story, still remains. Now, how can you use it? Anytime, go back to any time you're giving an opinion or advice, even at home. Back that opinion and advice from the experience that has created the opinion and advice. So if you're going to tell your, let's say you're telling your children that if you don't study hard, you will never be successful. How do you know that? There must be some reason you know that, no? Either because you know a friend who was very good, who didn't study and is now loitering around, or you know the three people who were average, but they studied and they did very well. So go back to the experience that has created the opinion. And when you do that, you could use that even at home.
This question from Nilesh Achwekar. He said, thanks for answering my previous questions and after sharing my learning and doodle on your book, my HR has asked me to create a small session on storytelling. So is there something you can guide me, or is there any courses that you have where I can have a deeper sense of learning to be able to share with my team?
So you've read the book. I remember you doodled and shared that with me, and I'd asked you to even put that up on Amazon. So I think if you go through the book and you can put yourself into the exercises that are there, you can self-learn. Yeah. The other is there is a small say option that has been created because of the COVID situation, which is I am running a discounted 75% discounted priced webinar series, including individual coaching, starting next Tuesday for a small batch of 20 people, as long as they are not sponsored by the company. If you are either a self-employed person, you're a freelancer, a coach, or you're employed but you're sponsoring your own education, you can join the course. We still have 2 seats left, and we start next Tuesday. I'm just going to put the email ID of the person in my team that is doing all the registrations. If this interests you, or anyone else on this call, just drop Anagha a line, and she will get back to you with details and how you could register. So that could be one. But again, you have the book. If you go through the exercise and design your sessions around that book, that would also be a good place to start.
There are a lot of questions actually in the space of is storytelling industry specific? So we have someone asking about the pharma industry, about the government industry, about automotive. To my knowledge from what you shared, it's not industry specific, but as that question keeps coming up, maybe you could give the further clarity on the same. Thank you.
So, no, storytelling is not industry. Okay, let me put it this way. It's agnostic to whichever situation or industry you're in. I have now worked with, I think, about 16, 17 industries, 50 different clients, and it has worked everywhere. Having said that, the more stories that you can share where the context is well understood by the person, and the more he will be able to understand it or imbibe it better. Let me give you an example. So let's say the point you're trying to make in a pharma industry, because you mentioned pharma, is to someone saying, the best way you can establish credibility with your client, in case of pharma, it'll be with your doctors, is to be transparent, right? Now, you could take an example of what does being transparent mean from any other industry, or you could take an example from far closer home. When you take it from far closer home, it'll have a higher impact. So I'm going to share a story about transparency from the pharma industry, which I had first picked up in the pharma industry and then used it to train people in pharma. So this is a story. I'm not going to name the company because we have client confidentiality. There's a large pharma company, and here is one of the sales reps telling me the story. He says, sir, I've just been promoted and placed in Bombay. Prior to being here, I was in Malegaon. Malegaon is a small coastal town near Bombay, and I never met my targets in most of my time there because targets in this company, sir, are very tough. Yeah. But suddenly one month of May, when the April results came out, I saw that I had actually crossed the target, and I was very surprised. And so I took out the data, and I saw that I had sold a huge amount of medicine X, but that's not possible. So I said, why? He said, because medicine X is a specialty medicine. It is for the post-operative care of the ear canal. And I don't even have an ENT surgeon, forget ENT, I don't even have an ENT specialist in Malegaon. So how can I'm selling? Because this is only prescribed for post-operative care of the ear canal, which means if someone has had a ear operation, the post-operative care uses medicine X. So I started looking at all the data and found out that all the sales had come actually from one locality. And when I went to the stores in that locality, I found that all the prescriptions they had serviced actually came from one doctor. And you know what the funny thing is, sir? That doctor is not even in my call list. I looked at our seminar list. He's never attended a seminar by us. So, but I found his clinic. I gave my card, waited for my turn. When he called me in, I introduced myself and thanked him for supporting our company. And I asked him, Doctor, under what condition do you prescribe medicine X? And the doctor said, well, if someone comes with a earache in this back portion of the ear, I first give them antibiotic A. If it doesn't work, I give them medicine X. He says, but sir, which colleague of mine told you that this is the right procedure and this is the right medicine for the problem you're talking about? Or did you come to a seminar? Because he said, no, that's not how it happened. I said, then how did it happen? Oh, well, I had a patient who had a bad earache here. I gave them antibiotic A. It didn't work. I told them to repeat antibiotic A. It still didn't work. He was in terrible pain. So I said, you better go to Bombay and meet Dr. Ismail Sheikh. Oh, you mean the ear surgeon? I don't know if he's a surgeon. I know he's a ENT specialist. And then about 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, I found this patient of mine in the bus stop. He was going to catch a bus. So I waved him and said, how are you? And he said, I'm fine, doctor. And so I said, what medicine did Dr. Sheikh give you? He says, I don't know the name. I'll get you the prescription. And the prescription said medicine X. I said, oh my God, doctor, I wish you had asked more questions. I don't know what his problem was, but I can guarantee you that Dr. Sheikh did an operation on the ear. And this was given only for post-operative care. It has steroids, etc. It is not for the indication you're talking about. In fact, it is not even off-label. Off-label in that industry means it doesn't say on the label, but you could use it. And so he says, doctor, I'm really sorry, but this is not the right medicine, and it is only going to harm your patient. I would really request you to not prescribe this medicine again. And I'm also sorry, we in this company don't have a medicine for this indication. And then he says, sir, after that, I never met my targets again. Now, that is such a powerful example of transparency. So what happens is, because you've used this example in the pharma industry, you get people to understand that story much more than if I use this in the automobile industry. But I'm sure a similar example of transparency must exist there as well. So that's what I would do.
This is from Ali Yawar. People are afraid of asking questions. How can storytelling be used to help bridge the gap between leadership authority and subordinate?
So I don't know if you can use storytelling to answer that question. Yeah. But the only thing I would say is, again, this is an opinion you have, right? Not what you stated is an opinion you have. What is the experience that you have that has created this opinion? If you can share that experience instead of just the opinion, you would get someone to sort of listen to you and imbibe what you're saying. Gautam, there's a very interesting question here from Paul.
Paul Dupuy, yeah.
Yeah.
Randstad. Just look at that next question.
Yeah.
We know that people join the leader, not the brand. They stay in the organizations because of people and leave because of people. I've discovered that this is absolutely true in India. What are your thoughts on the kind of stories which specifically touch millennials and Gen Zs and build followership and loyalty?
Very, very good question, Paul. So to me, the thing is not just about millennials and Gen Z. Is as a leader, how can I connect with you? What I mean by that is we connect with people like us, right? So I'm pretty certain that everyone in this call, if you can think back to your first day in your first job, who did the MD or CEO of that company feel like to you? The chances are that person felt like God, not someone like you. Now, the only way I get to be a great follower is when I understand that person, God, is someone like me. So how do you do that? You tell stories from your life which show that you are someone like them. And as you can share more and more stories to show that you are just like that person, that's one way that you get closer. The second, Paul, is if you can show your vulnerability, yeah, through the stories of, we talked about it, of the mistakes you made and what you've learned from it, and show that you are human, you'll get that connection more. So share stories of who you are and what makes you who you are. And so we call that connection stories. Yeah. Let me give you an example, which uh, is not necessarily as a leader, but you'll get the sense. So imagine that I am going to a bank and I am looking for a working capital loan. And so I filled the working capital loan form, and I've been asked to go and introduce myself to the bank manager. Now, one way to do it is the one way that people usually would do, which is a mini resume. I'm the founder of Storyworks. I've been doing this for 8 years. We've got great clients. I'm a computer science engineer. I studied in Jadavpur University, then did an MBA from an IIM, worked in Levers and Tatas and Mahindras, and we've been working very hard, and we know we can expand provided I had the right working capital. Here's my form. That would possibly be the way I would normally introduce myself. If I had to use storytelling, perhaps I could say something like this. To say, hi, my name is Indranil, and I was born in Shillong, in the northeast of the country, and to a middle class family. But somehow my parents managed to put me into a premier education institute where almost all my classmates were from more affluent families, tea garden kids and the others. And they always had more money to spend in the tuck shop, the canteen. So I remember when I was in class 3, I came up with this idea of running a comic circulating library, that too with some borrowed comics. And I made a bit of money, and that really excited me. And stuff like that has always been very exciting. I finished my schooling in Shillong, went to Calcutta, stayed in a hostel, studied in Jadavpur University, did my IIM, joined Levers, Tatas, Mahindras. 8 years ago, I started Storyworks. We've been working very hard. Our clients are pretty happy with the work we've done. And we know that we can expand and expand profitably if we had the right working capital. Here's the form I filled. I hope you'll see it favorably. I'm sure all of you would agree that the chances of getting the loan in the second version is dramatically higher. Now, let me take that a little further. Let's say this bank manager has the approval authority of only 10 lakhs, and I've asked for 15. Now he goes to his boss, and he says, "Boss, we should give IC from Storyworks a loan." And the boss says, "Why? What's he like?" What do you think that the bank manager might say about me? How would they describe me? Who am I? What's my values, capability, etc.? Can you guys just type it in the chat box? If you were the bank manager and you heard the story, and what would you conclude about me? I'm adaptive. Okay. What else? Just go to the chat box and type in, what would you conclude about me? I'm self-made. I'm adaptive. What else? Just key in a few more. Innovative, achiever, different, entrepreneur, enterprising, all the right words that I would want my bank manager to know. So going back, Paul, if you could say that, what is it, and if you take it as millennials or Gen Z, what about you, if they knew, would they become a great followers of yours? And so you can do two things. One is you tell stories about you, which tells them that. The second thing you can do is something I call story triggering, and I've written about it in my book, which is, how can you be the hero of stories other people tell about you? So how can you demonstrate to people who you stand for? And as you do that demonstration, people get to understand who you are. Let me give you an example. So there was a CEO which I worked with, and we talked about story triggering. And one of the things that he wanted to do on his, as he sort of took over the role of the CEO in that company, was to tell people that he believes in equality. And so he was planning to do this webcast and talk about equality. And I said, no, I want you to, no one listens to what you're saying. People listen to what you do. So use the opportunity to be open to demonstrating what you believe is equality. I can't make a formula for you, but use opportunity. And that opportunity came on day one of his job. So on day one of his job, he was being taken through the whole company, being introduced to people. Here's finance, and this is the head of finance. Here's HR, and when he went to the second floor of the company with the storing party being introduced, he noticed that there was something common between the two floors, the ground floor and the first floor, which is there was a series of meeting rooms, all of which were occupied. There were people waiting outside to get in, but there was one which was empty. And there was a sign on it, like it was in the ground floor. And so he goes up to the sign and it says, can be booked by GM and above only. He looks at the sign, tears it off, puts it into pieces, throws it into the dustbin, comes back and tells the touring party, gentlemen, give me a minute, runs downstairs, goes to the similar room, sees that the sign is the same, pulls it out, tears it, puts it down, comes back and says, let's continue. By evening that day, across the organization, people were talking about this new leader who believes in equality. So if you can figure out what will make people loyal and follow you, and then demonstrate that, or tell stories about where you have demonstrated that, those are the two things that can help. I hope that answers your question, Paul.
The next question I'd like to ask is from Akash. Can business storytelling be implemented on a phone call? And if yes, how do you know it's the right time?
Okay, as I said earlier, there's always the right time for stories, right? Now, I would prefer if I could tell the story face to face, because I can see the expression. And in any communication, the verbal part of my communication is just, depending on which study you're looking at, between 7 to 11%. Whereas the non-verbal part of my communication is the rest of it. So if I can be visible, whether it is through being face to face or in a web like this, I would prefer it. But let's say I didn't have the option and it was just about an audio call. Now, if you compare an audio call where I go like, okay, guys, this is what it is. This is the data. This is what I want you to do. Versus if I said, guys, let me share something that comes to my mind. 5 years ago, even if I just said that, do you or do you not feel that they'll be more interested at the other end of the phone call? Yeah, because we love stories and that's what we would like to do. So so that's my answer.
This is another question. Are there particularly effective story structures that you have seen? And can you share any examples of how they've been used? Yeah.
There are many story structures. If you go by Joseph Campbell, who wrote the biggest book on this, he's talked about the fact that across cultures and across stories, there are only seven unique story types. It's a book we call The Hero's Journey. Yeah. So, and in that, in among that, he said one of them is more powerful. But in the work that we do, we are not into many of those story structures that let's say Joseph Campbell talks about. In the work of leadership storytelling or sales storytelling, we are talking about just taking experiences and sharing them. And the usual story structure for that is a story mountain. You don't even have to learn that. It automatically comes. And the story mountain really starts with exposition, rising tension, climax, falling tension, conclusion. But that's what any which way any story would have. There are story structures that I talk about in the book, which is where you're not creating a story. You are just putting a message into a structure like a story. So one of the areas of consulting work I do is help organizations take their messages like strategy, transformation, etc., and help that to be embedded across the organizations. And what I then sit and do with the team is I take their sort of message and craft it in like a story. So I don't write a story about the strategy. I write the strategy like a story. So if you take the basics of stories and then take your message and craft it like that, that's all you need to learn when it comes to business storytelling. Yes, if you're trying to do presentations or speeches, you could use many of the other story structures.
Next question. I keep hearing about story showing as opposed to storytelling. What is your take and views on this distinction?
Okay, so I don't like it. I don't think it's great if I was a performer, yeah, or it's great if I was doing this on a stage. There is a person, I just can't recall his name just now, in the US who does a lot of this, which to me that's theater, yeah. And as soon as we do story showing, and so one thing of story showing is how do I, so let's say I was going to say, and then I put the luggage up on the rack. Yeah. Now, as soon as I do that, it is too much of performance. Yes, I can use my hands to do some gesturing, but and when I start doing performance, it is not something that is really going to be accepted very well in an organization. So I would stick, if you're asking me, I would stick to storytelling, and I would stick to real experiences being shared in that storytelling.
Thank you, IC. As we're coming close to the end of this session in the next few minutes, what would be the key things that we could do next from today's session in terms of storytelling? How do we start practicing it and moving? What would you suggest as next steps?
So three steps. The first and the easiest step is, as you're at home, and the next conversation that you'll have either with people at home, or if you're having a conversation with someone in office over the phone, and you're going to give an opinion, before you shout out that opinion, can you pause and ask yourself, where do I get that opinion from? Why do I believe that opinion? And share the story, that or the experience you went through that created your opinion. So that's the first step you can do on story. As far as the question of business storytelling is concerned, one of the easiest way, of course, is to buy. If you liked what we have said, then buy my book. I think it's like $240, and if you're a self learner, then there is exercises the book does. And like someone had asked, if there is something that works better for you in terms of hearing it, there is an Audible. The third is join a course. Yeah, and there I would say two things. One is learn storytelling from people who've been in business, and learn storytelling from people who don't just run a workshop, but actually add coaching and help you practice and get feedback. So if you can find something like that, that's a great way to start.
Thank you, IC. This question's from Sushil Basin. Tightening the story has always been a challenge to me. I have powerful stories, they come to me naturally, but I often get a feeling that the story was very long. How could I shorten that to ensure I still have value and impact in that?
I didn't get the name of the person who has asked the question.
This is Sushil Basin, Brigadier Sushil Basin.
So Brigadier Sushil, it looks like you didn't join this webinar right at the beginning. No, the reason I'm saying this, I've answered this question already twice, but I'm going to again repeat it. One of the ways in which you can tighten your story is, so first record the story maybe on a mobile, because that's how you will say it. Now that you've got the recording, listen to the recording and write it down, transcribe that story. Then go with a pen and cut out every word you can and every line you can, which you can be taken out, but it will still sort of pass the message in. And when you have that, you've got a tight story. The second thing that you can do is make sure you're not trying to give three messages in the same story, because then you'll make your story very long. Stick to one message in a story, and stick to, taking out everything that you don't need, and then you have a story. It's not the easiest thing to do. Yeah. Leonardo da Vinci had said, simplicity, is the ultimate sophistication, right? And it takes a lot of work to get simple, but then it becomes worth it.
Great, thanks, IC. I think rather than the questions there are a lot more questions which we can review again later. How would you like to share some closing comments for the audience today, so that they could look forward to taking their journey forward?
Okay. So I'm going to close with a story that I was told by someone who was in my workshop once. And he said, I've been reflecting on something you said, and it reminds me of something. I said, go ahead. He says, many people in this company don't know that I was a very good cricketer. I never made it to the national team, but I actually represented the state team, which I don't think anyone in this company knows. I was a fantastic batsman. I was the best in school and best in college. And when I was in the university, I was still the best. And I didn't want to practice because I was pretty good at it. My coach kept telling me that you need to come for early morning practice. And I used to keep telling my coach, find me someone who's better than me, and then I'll practice. But one day, I got a call from my coach saying, can you come to the stadium tomorrow morning? And this guy is in Bangalore. So he says, why? I know there's a India versus Pakistan match on. What do you want me to do? He said, no, just don't come for the match. Come very early. So he says, I land up at the stadium early, and I see that people are practicing. The net's a little far away, and my coach says, who's there in the net? Can you see? He says, I couldn't figure out, but it was a short guy. And so the coach said, come closer. And he said, I came closer and I realized it was Sachin Tendulkar. And my coach looked at me and said, how good a batsman is he? He said, yeah, pretty good. How many centuries? He said, 50 centuries. Yeah. He said, then why is he practicing on the net? And that's when it struck me that if I had to be ahead in my game, I would need to practice. And he says, when Sachin played his last match at the Wankhede Stadium, I flew down from Bangalore. And on the last day of the test match, for those of you who remember, Sachin was not out the previous evening and he would come into bat. And that morning, he says, I went to the nets early. And when I went there, there was this guy who was rated as the best batsman in the world, who had scored more than 100 hundreds at the net, still practicing. So my concluding thing would be, if you want to get good at it, good at storytelling, the steps are very similar to get good at speaking, which is 4: instruction, imitation, practice, and critique. Yeah, instruction is getting someone or a book or whatever that tells you how to. Yeah, so that's number 1. Imitation, listen to things. We are now in lockdown. Listen to TED Talks. Listen to people who tell good stories. 3 is practice, and we talked about practice, practice, and practice. And 4 is practice and record yourself, and then listen to that recording and say, what did I like about this? Start being able to critique your stories, and if you do that, you'll become a great storyteller. So that's how I would finish this session.
Thank you very much, IC. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll update the participants on our next program with yourself so we could continue the conversation. It's been great learning 2 back-to-back weeks. On behalf of Indraneel and myself, thank you for participating in our Q&A today online. We look forward to staying in touch with each of you. Do connect with Indraneel and myself on LinkedIn. It's a pleasure to stay connected and provide value. Thank you once again. Anything from your side, IC?
No, thank you for being here, and story on.
Great. Thank you very much.